All right, so today we're talking about, can communism and capitalism coexist in China? So we talked already about how communism came to power in China. We talked about how Mao Zedong came to power and how Mao Zedong was as a leader. And today we're going to talk about China kind of more moving forward into the 1980s and 1990s and to today, and how China is trying to create a capitalist society that still is communist. But the first question is, why was Mao unable to succeed in these areas? So Mao Zedong dies in 1976. The man who comes to power to succeed him is a man named Deng Xioping.
I searched this school.
So Deng Xioping. And so Deng Xioping tried to take on this idea of 4 modernizations: industry, agriculture, technology, and national defense. All of these things, basically, Mao was pretty much a failure in. Industry, because if you remember, he tried to make everyone make steel in their backyard. Agriculture, because of the Great Leap Forward or the Great Leap Backward, and because his emphasis was so much on the peasantry that they weren't really moving forward in areas like technology and national defense. So Deng is going to try to move China forward and to achieve what he referred to as the 4 modernizations. So when Deng Xioping comes to power, he is considered China's paramount leader, and his goal was to end the upheavals of the Mao era and to establish economic stability and growth. So a lot of things that had been banned under Mao were now allowed in China. So for instance, plays, operas, films, translations of Western books were reappeared. There even came a genre called literature of the wounded, which exposed the sufferings of the people during the Cultural Revolution. About 100,000 political prisoners were released and restored to important positions in government. And the party basically evaluated themselves. They criticized Mao's mistakes, but he still was praised as the revolutionary leader and the one who brought China to communism. So that's why Mao is still on money in China, and Mao's face is still all over China and is still revered in China, but they acknowledge that Mao made a couple of, to say the least, mistakes. Now, under Deng, he wanted to really move China forward economically. One of the ways that he did that was dismantling the collectivized farms that Mao had set up and return to more small-scale agriculture, which gained him a great deal of support from the peasants, because the peasants saw this as a new opportunity for themselves. He also instituted a more gradual industrial reform. The state was still the manager of most of the enterprises, but the managers of these state enterprises were given greater authority and were encouraged to act more like private owners for the seeking of profit. And China was opened up to the world economy, and they began to welcome foreign investment, especially what was referred to as special enterprise zones on the coast, and foreign capitalists were beginning to get tax breaks. So if we see here, there also was then a large emphasis placed on things like science and the study of science, and that's why we see here this image of this girl and all these different images, scientific images in the background. And we see here, this is obviously from the 80s because that computer is huge, but Mao was still seen again as the benevolent revolutionary leader, but the emphasis that China was going to be placed on now was national defense, science, and industry. Here you can see this idea of moving forward from 1985 towards the new millennium in 2000, and how China was going to become more of a rising country in the areas of science, space exploration, and all these various different things. So local governments and private entrepreneurs joined in what were referred to as township and village enterprises, in which they would produce food, they would produce clothing and building materials. What we wind up seeing happening in China is a stunning economic growth, one of the most rapid and sustained in world history. The people in China began to eat better diets, the mortality rates went down, poverty declined, there was massive urban construction and surging exports and an improved standard of living for the people in China. Now, despite that, though, doesn't mean that everything is perfect. There was still a great deal of corruption amongst the officials and large inequalities between the coast and the interior. So on the coasts of China, very advanced, very modern. big, huge cities. In the interior, you still have a lot of poverty and not a great deal of development. So there's still also within the cities a lot of overcrowding, really bad inflation, really bad pollution, and inflation. So in a lot of these cities, street crime was common, prostitution was common, gambling, drug addiction, and like the criminal underworld, like an organized crime, began to come back. For Mao, this would have been his worst nightmare, because basically what they're seeing is capitalism being restored to China, which would have been his worst fears. But we see in China's desire to become more open, we see foreign companies coming in. So this is an image of McDonald's in Nanjing. Here you can see just how horrible the pollution is. This is in Beijing. You can see in the distance, this is a very interesting architectural building that the Chinese that they were working on, but you can still see the smog. And this is considered what they would call a clear day. In Beijing, you don't really get sunny days. You just get kind of these like hazy, very polluted days. If you remember when leading up to the Beijing Olympics, China being such an authoritarian state, they shut down all of the factories for like a couple of weeks before the Olympics to kind of like clear the air of Beijing, because there was real fears that the athletes would have a great deal, especially in like the track and field competitions, would have a great deal of problems trying to breathing in this very thick, heavy, polluted air. But so this is an image of Beijing. This I took from my hotel window, and this kind of shows you exactly kind of like the dualities that you see in a lot of places in China. Because in the distance you see this very modern skyline with these very modern buildings. That actually over there is a Walmart. And then in the foreground, you see just like a mass of buildings kind of built in a very haphazard manner. And these buildings at one point would have been like courtyard homes. So like this whole square here would have been one house, and it would have been all built around a courtyard. It would have been a house of a wealthier family. And because the overcrowding and kind of the haphazardness as more and more people were moving into Beijing, they started building homes inside of the courtyard. So it's like you have to walk through somebody else's house to get into your house, and it's just this very haphazard, crazy building that the government's now slowly starting to tear down and replace, but then a lot of these people that live in these homes are being displaced. So you could see in this image here, you can see kind of like the buildings behind buildings, but with no like real streets to get to them. Now also, like I said, the coastline tends to be very developed, the interior not so much. So this is a village in the interior of China outside of Xi'an. And we do see some modern amenities like electricity, power lines, but then you also see some not so modern amenities like this. This is the latrine for the block of apartments. So they don't have running water in their houses. So they have electricity, but they don't have running water. So we see, parts of China very advanced, parts of China not so advanced. And here's this older gentleman standing in front of his home. But they do have cell phones though, so you have China Mobile, but you don't have running water. And so here we see one other thing that's kind of interesting with China. They don't really have things like copyright laws, so this you see a lot in China, like reusing of what we think of, like that Apple symbol is like Apple computers, and there's no computer being sold in that store. It has nothing to do with Apple computers, but they're using the logo. Like we look at this one here, Disney Sport, there's nothing that's Disney related inside that store. So they kind of just like steal like trademarks and things. Here we can see this is again a Walmart and a KFC. I had to show you that in the distance. Now this is the city of Shanghai. This is a road called Nanjing Road. It's one of the more popular spots in Shanghai. It's very advanced, very modern, very developed. This is one of those cities that would be that where you would have the special enterprise zones on the coast, because Shanghai is right on the coast, and where you would have foreign capitalists coming in to get large tax breaks. It's a large city of international business. Here's me in front of the Starbucks. So I was very happy at that point. It was my first Starbucks the whole time I had been in China, and I was kind of craving it. Now this is along the Yangtze River in Shanghai. This is an area referred to as the Buns. So the Chinese government spends tons of money making Shanghai look very, very modern and flashy. It almost looks like the Vegas Strip. It's so lit up. There's all these very modern European style buildings built along the Buns, along the waterfront. The government spends, I don't even know how many millions of dollars to kind of keep this all lit up and illuminated. And in a lot of ways, it's a show to kind of impress all of the foreign visitors that are coming into China. Whereas, again, if you go into the interior of China, you get a much different story of what it's like there. Here you can see this another image of the Bund. This I just thought was interesting because the Chinese ride bikes everywhere. In a lot of places outside of Europe, outside the United States, a lot of people use their bikes, and none of these bikes were locked up. This was in front of a train station in Shanghai. So I just thought it was so interesting. Like if this was New York, like these bikes would have been stolen in 2 seconds. Also, when I was in China, I had the opportunity to visit 2 schools, and I got to see kind of the contrast between the two. This is a rural elementary school, so not very modern, not very many amenities. This is kind of like the students' work. The students are actually put to work to do manual labor. So when we walked into the classroom, these brooms and shovels and everything were like piled up in the corner. And as we were walking out of the school, we saw like a bunch of little kids like on their hands and knees doing manual labor. But so this was the teacher. And this was some of the students. These were 5th graders. We gave them kind of like a little English lesson, and then these were the 2nd graders. But we just noticed the room is just a very simple room. There's no computers, there's no electricity. They had latrines, so they didn't have running water. So again, not many amenities available to the students. You can see them all out in the courtyard. And then as we were leaving, these were the kids that were doing work, kind of picking out the weeds out of the bricks. So a lot of these kids in China, they get tracked kind of at a very young age, so they get sent to either a school that's going to put them more towards a higher level job, or a job that's going to take you more towards manual labor. So if we look at this was a school I visited in Nanjing. It was a high school, much different amenities. Some of the kids here who came from other parts of China who tested into the school focused on aeronautics, so who tested into the school, they actually lived in the school. Otherwise it was like a boarding school. Otherwise there were kids just from the area of Nanjing. So you can see here computers, approximately, like what we would think of in a school in the U.S. This I just thought was funny because we see the ping pong tables, and the name over the door was labeled gymnasium, which I thought was kind of funny. There's me playing some ping pong in China. But so here, these are the students in high school. They go to school in a much different way than we do. They go for, first of all, they wear uniforms. They go for, I think their periods are similar to our periods, like 40, 50-minute periods. They get 10 minutes in between each period where they're allowed to go outside and run around, talk to their friends, hang out. And then they come back in. The teacher stays down the hallway in their offices during this 10-minute time, so the teachers aren't even around. But there's a great deal of respect for the teachers. There's actually a whole holiday dedicated to teachers. You can see these are some of the students. They all spoke English very, very well. They were all very curious about U.S. students and how things happened in the U.S. They would go to school. They have a 2-hour break in the middle of the day, and during that 2-hour break, they said they go home and they eat lunch, they take a nap, or they do some homework, and then they come back to school. But the length of their school day, they're in school much later than we would be in school, and they go to school all through the summertime as well. And this I just thought was interesting to show you how different bathrooms are in other parts of the world. So this was the bathroom stalls, which is kind of strange because there's no door and there's really no toilet. It's just a trench that you squat over and go, and there's no door. So kind of an awkward situation, to say the least. So here's me and some of my friends as we're heading onto the railway system in Shanghai. So here's also more traditional parts of Shanghai, contrasting with the very modern Shanghai that I showed you before. You can see this is kind of where more of the common people live, which looks much different than the fancier areas that are all kind of played up for, international business. So the next question is democracy actually possible in China? So we still have a lot of restrictions on personal liberties in China. One, of course, the most notable being the one-child policy. So in a desire to curb population growth and overpopulation, it's illegal to have more than one child in China. Unless your child happens to be a girl. If the first child's a girl, you're allowed to try for a boy. If your second child's a girl, that's it. You can't try a third time for a boy. If you decide to break the rule and have a second child, that child is basically a non-entity in the government. They can't go to school. They can't get any legal recognition from the government, and the family is ridiculously taxed in punishment for having that second child. But because of that, there's a huge emphasis placed on boys over girls, and as a result, many women will find out the sex of the baby and abort the baby if they find out they're having a girl, or they'll put their daughters up for adoption. So if you go to a Chinese orphanage, you're going to find it filled with girls and very few boys, unless they have some sort of physical or mental disability, then they might be given up. So there's a huge campaign in China to try to be like, girl babies are okay too. Love your girl babies, don't just have your boy babies. So we see another kind of emphasis showing that the Chinese family and it being a girl baby. One thing I also just thought was interesting, this was going into a park in China, and I just like pointing this picture out because I don't really know what you're actually allowed to do in this park, because you can't ride a bike, you can't pick the flowers, you can't sit, you can't play music, you can't really do much of anything. So I just think that's kind of sad. You can't walk a dog, you're just allowed to be in the park. This is also when I was in Tiananmen Square, and noticed that this one family just like thrust their child in my arms and had me take a picture with this child. Don't know why they wanted me to take a picture, but they were very excited about having, I guess, some tall American holding their baby. But the main thing talking about with China trying to become democratic is the issue of what becomes known as the Tiananmen Square protests, and eventually known as the Tiananmen Square, unfortunately, the Tiananmen Square massacre. So Tiananmen Square is it's one of the largest public squares in the world. And so even though the Chinese Communist Party was moving towards being more capitalistic and giving up more freedoms, they still weren't willing to give up control. They still were not willing to promote democracy. Deng Xioping said that if China went towards democracy, China would once again be plunged into chaos, division, regression, and darkness. He connected democracy with the Cultural Revolution. And so because there had been such a loosening up of restrictions, this kind of gave a signal to the people thinking that maybe, despite what Deng was saying, that maybe China would be more willing to become more open and more democratic. And so what happens in the spring of 1989, there was a growing sentiment among university students and others for political and economic reform. And this was kind of also coupled with the fact that the central government had encouraged some people to assume a more active political role, but you had these hardliners in the government that didn't want there to be this movement towards more liberalism. So one of the issues was there's this man, his name was Hu Yaobang, and he was the Chinese Communist Party General Secretary, and he had encouraged democratic reforms. And in response for being encouraging these democratic reforms, in 1987 he was forced to resign his post. What happened was he died of natural causes in the spring of 1989, and he was transformed into a martyr for the cause of political liberalization. And so on the day of his funeral, tens of thousands of students gathered in Tiananmen Square, beginning to protest and demand democratic reforms. And then over the next several weeks, the crowds grew in various sizes. Basically, they were joined by a whole bunch of individuals wanting political, social, and economic reforms. At some point, the crowd grew to as large as 1 million people. And the Chinese government at first didn't really know how to handle it or what to do with these large crowds. At the same time that this was all going on, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, who was starting to undertake reforms within the Soviet Union that was bringing more liberalization in the Soviet Union, was visiting on a state visit in China. So this also was a signal to the people that maybe they could get their voices heard and maybe the government was more willing to kind of loosen up. And because Gorbachev was there and on this state visit, the international press was there. So there was large-scale coverage. There was, international media all over Tiananmen Square filming the protests, which kind of put the Chinese government in a very awkward position. So all of this was being broadcast overseas. So initially the government kind of issued warnings, but they didn't want to really take any action against the crowds. In addition, though, there was demonstrations that started in other Chinese cities like Shanghai, Nanjing, Xi'an. But because the outside media coverage was in Beijing, this is where they kind of grew the largest. Basically, the government kind of didn't know what to do. They didn't quite know how to handle these protests. Some advocated negotiating with the demonstrators and offering concessions, but ultimately they were overruled by the hardliners, in particular Deng Xioping, who, fearing anarchy, wanted to forcefully suppress the revolts, the protests. So during the last 2 weeks of May, martial law was declared in Beijing. Army troops were stationed around the city. But any attempt for the troops to reach Tiananmen Square was actually thwarted because all the Beijing citizens would flood into their streets and block their view. So the protesters remained in large numbers, and they built, you can kind of see it here, this large statue that they called the Goddess of Democracy, and she kind of looked a little bit like the Statue of Liberty, and we see that there was a huge Western presence there. But the government really basically decided that this was, in essence, like an embarrassment, and they couldn't let this continue to go on. So on the night of June 3rd into June 4th, tanks and heavily armed troops advanced towards Tiananmen Square. They opened fire on the crowd, or crushing those in the crowd with the tanks who tried to block their way. And then once the soldiers reached the square, many of the demonstrators left. They kind of chose to leave. By the morning, the area had been mostly cleared of protesters, but the military was also then moving in and forcefully removing protesters in other Chinese cities. And they were, by June 5th, the military had complete control over the area, but many people have been killed. Some say as high as 241, with some 7,000 people wounded. And here you can see an image of all the tanks kind of moving into the square. And these are some of the protesters who had been killed. Now, this image here is probably one of the most famous and iconic images of the Tiananmen Square massacre or protest. This happened on June 5th. Basically, this lone protester basically like faced down a column of tanks. So the tank would try to move around him and he would move in front of him. The tank would try to move around him and he would move in front of him. He's basically known as Tank Man. No one really knows particularly what happened to him. They don't think he was arrested because other protesters kind of like reached out and grabbed him and like took him back into the crowd. So no one actually knows who Tank Man is or what actually happened to him, but he's kind of like the symbol of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And I thought this was interesting because to see it in perspective, like this is the top one, this is like the closed-in image, and that's like the most famous image. But really, there's a whole nother line of tanks behind him that he was kind of standing up to. Now, this I also thought was interesting because this man here is someone who had gotten run over by a tank and actually lost limbs as a result of this. So basically, there was a complete crackdown and elimination of the protests. In China today, it is, you cannot search anything that has to do with Tiananmen Square. If you try to search Tank Man, or if you try to search June 4th, or you try to, nothing comes up. So this picture was actually done as an attempt to try to thwart the Chinese censors, but they were still able to kind of, this eventually was taken down in China as well. I also wanted to show you some images of what Tiananmen Square looks like today. So it is a massive, large square. That's the entrance of it on one end. It's heavily guarded. There's soldiers all around. There are cameras everywhere. So if you look at here, these are all cameras. You have to go through the Chinese going into Tiananmen Square. You have to like go through like an underground passage to get into the square. Westerners are allowed to just go right through, but all the Chinese have to go through metal detectors to make sure they don't have any types of goods on them. That you can see in the distance is the Forbidden City with the big portrait of Mao. And you could see why 1 million people would have fit in this square. It's, like I said, it's one of the largest public squares in the world. But this, and here's some Chinese students kind of joking around in the square. So today, like, most of the Chinese people don't even really know what happened in this square and what the Chinese government did to them, because they've so repressed any of the stories about what happened. But it kind of shows that the people thought that they might be able to get more rights, and since then they still haven't. Yes, China's a growing country. Yes, China's capitalist in a lot of ways, and yes, China has a strong economy. But in the end, it's still very much an authoritarian state where the people do not have many rights or privileges. Which takes us to this idea: can they coexist in China?